Welcome to Foreign Countries, Conversations in Archaeology with me, Ash Lenton. The website is foreigncountries.podbean.com. If you're enjoying Foreign Countries and you think it's worth $2 a month just to keep it going, please become a patron of the show. Go to patron.podbean.com/foreign countries. There was a time when archaeologists in all parts of the world were concerned with telling grand narratives about the past. In Australia, like most other places, there has been a refocusing on the diversity and complexity of the past. Today, I'm talking to Sean Ulm, Professor of Archaeology at James Cook University. Sean is the Deputy Director of CABAR, the ARC Centre of Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. I'm quoting now, CABAR is focused on using transdisciplinary approaches to tell a culturally inclusive, globally significant human and environmental history of Australia. So to talk about Australian archaeology's journey from grand narratives to stories of local level diversity, Sean is my ideal starting point. His career has followed that trajectory from a frustration with those generalisations to, in his words, high-resolution, community-driven research collaborations. We're going to talk about 4 different journal papers today, starting with a position paper in Quaternary International in 2013. Sean, can we start with that position paper, and can you tell me where that has led your research since then?
Australian archaeology has been dominated by grand narratives, and by that I mean that we've actually got relatively few data points on the landscape in terms of where archaeological research has been conducted. And for the last 50 years, we've been writing syntheses, trying to tell the grand narrative of what happened in Australia's deep past from those limited data points. And that goes all the way back to John Mulvaney's The Prehistory of Australia, published in 1969. And I became increasingly dissatisfied with the validity of those grand narratives. I just felt that they needed to be based on more robust evidence. And I increasingly felt that trying to tell the archaeological story of vast landscapes gloss over a lot of diversity and tend to homogenise a whole lot of different cultures and societies into a single type of trajectory. And of course, we know when Europeans invaded Australia in the late 18th century, they encountered enormous diversity in Aboriginal societies and cultures and Torres Strait Islander cultures and societies. And there's no reason why we shouldn't expect that kind of cultural diversity in the past as well. So the idea of that particular paper was to say, how can we grapple with the continental narrative and tell it in a more meaningful way? And I guess I was suggesting, is that the best way to tell a robust story of our continent and its people is to A, work closely with those people, but B, develop really detailed and robust regional chronologies that begin to tell the story of that diversity of people through time and space.
So you're looking at an emphasis on a more complex and variable set of stories across the continent.
So as an example, it's commonly believed that Aboriginal population sizes increase through time, and particularly during the late Holocene. And this is often written as a continent-wide population increase. But we know from the archaeological record that not all regions of the continent appeared to experience population rise at the same time. And in fact, there's evidence that different regions at different times were depopulated, perhaps abandoned. So when we zoom in and treat different regions on their own terms, we begin to reveal some of the diversity. Of course, over a broader time span, when we're talking about the deeper history of Australia, the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago appears to have caused massive disruptions to Aboriginal populations across the continent. And perhaps large areas of the continent were depopulated and people may well have moved into better watered parts of the continent. Perhaps not entirely abandoning landscapes, but certainly depopulating them. So when we draw a line and say people came to Australia and population increased steadily, it actually hampers our ability to tell a more nuanced story of the human past.
So taking a more localised view of human land use, and I'm thinking about your 2020 Holocene paper now on the Kayardild people of the Gulf of Carpentaria, how did you and your colleagues use specific techniques and strategies to understand the exploitation of the Wellesley Islands?
When we want to investigate diversity in the past, we need to clearly understand cultural and environmental parts of the deep past and the relationship between the two. So by that, I mean we need to understand human-environment interaction, to understand the meaning of patterns that we're seeing in the archaeological record. To give you an example, in our work with collaborating with Kydelt people in the South Wellesley Islands, we wanted to understand how Kydelt people came to live on those islands and how things changed through time and how they managed their land and seascapes using a variety of technologies, including fire technologies. But one of the fundamental environmental factors which conditioned Kydelt use of those islands was the availability of fresh water. So if there's no available fresh water on the islands, then the type of occupation of those islands might be quite limited or quite different than what we see on islands with permanent water sources. So one of the questions we wanted to answer was, when was fresh water available on those islands as they formed post-Holocene sea level high stand? And how did those freshwater sources change through time?
And how did you go about that?
So to do that, we needed to collaborate with a range of paleoecologists and palynologists, and we undertook a program of coring swamps and salt flats and clay pans across the South Wellesley archipelago. What those records showed us is that the freshwater sources that we see on the island today only began being created in the last 1,000 years. And in the pollen record, we see a very distinct change from salt-tolerant taxa to more aquatic taxa in those pollen records, which is denoting a change in landscape, that as sea level decreases in the last 4,000 years after Holocene sea level high stand, we see the landscape prograding. We see ridge and swale dune systems being created. And in the swales between those dunes, we see environments being created that are conducive to freshwater swamp creation. So what this tells us is that conditions for permanent settlement were probably only ideal in the last 1,000 years. Even though the archaeological record of the South Wellesley Islands shows us that Kydelt people have been using the archipelago for the last 3,500 years, the type of occupation before 1,000 years ago was likely very different. People may have been visiting these islands for specific foraging activities and hunting activities during certain times of the year. And the archaeological record certainly reflects a dramatic increase in Aboriginal occupation in the last 1,000 years, which is coincident to the development of those freshwater sources. So what those integrated records are telling us is that we need to understand the changing landscape people are living in to understand the activities that are taking place on the landscape.
And moving from the islands to the coastal regions, you used a different and very much multidisciplinary approach to look at fish traps in particular.
Stone-walled intertidal fish traps are a major feature around the Australian coastline, and they occur in considerable densities and sizes in northern Queensland, Torres Strait and the Gulf of Carpentaria, but they do occur all around the Australian margin, and they sometimes cover quite large areas, but they've been quite difficult to study in the sense that they're normally comprised entirely of stone. So they're quite difficult features to get a chronology on them because there's no organic material to radiocarbon date in them. But they're clearly important features in the landscape. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people engineered in the intertidal zones around islands and coastlines, and provided a really important form of production for aquaculture. So in our work with Kydelt people in the South Wellesley Islands, we began thinking more and more about fish trap. In the first 10 years we collaborated with Kydelt people, we mainly focused on terrestrial archaeology, so shell middens and coring swamps and understanding the terrestrial landscape. But right from the very first meetings, traditional owners made it clear that the fish traps were very important to them. Storm surge and cyclones and other natural events were damaging those fish traps, and fish traps are a really important part of Kydelt cultural identity and are very prominent in oral histories and in contemporary artworks. So we began to think about how we might approach studying fish traps. And we began by looking at conventional aerial photography, where you look at aerial photographs and you draw a line where you think you see fish traps. And the problem we found with that is that there were a lot of fish traps that weren't visible on the aerial photography, that were eroded, for example, or were only a single line of rocks, or were in areas where sedimentation had largely covered the structures.
So you need a different technology to get over that problem.
We designed a program of using drones to target specific areas where fish traps have high densities. And we flew those with industrial-sized drones mounted with DSLR cameras. And the results gave us a digital elevation model for those areas where 1 pixel was about 1 centimetre in resolution. So that was incredibly high resolution digital elevation models. And we were able to use those to model not only the size of individual walls and fish trap pens, but the way that those fish trap operated over different tidal cycles. So as well as collecting the data for the size and length and volume of the fish traps, we were also collecting digital elevation data for the intertidal landscape that the fish traps were situated in, which enabled us to do that sort of modelling. Now, the drone work is very labour intensive, and we were only able to cover about 10 square kilometres with the drones, which left tens of kilometres of coastline where we only had conventional aerial photography available. So we ran our own LiDAR run and we flew the entire coastline of all the islands in the South Wellesley archipelago at low tide. And we were able to integrate that lower resolution LiDAR data with the higher resolution drone data to make a seamless digital elevation model for the entire land and seascape. But it's very clear that there are hundreds of fish traps, and some fish traps have walls more than 1 kilometre long.
So then, in a PLoS ONE paper in 2020, you highlighted that there is a large part missing, those areas that are now submerged underwater. So how did you design methodologies to try and understand them?
So as we've talked about before, a long-standing concern of mine has been in exploring the diversity of Indigenous cultures in Australia through space and time on the basis of collaborating closely with Aboriginal traditional owners. One of the things that's always been a concern to me is that nearly a quarter of the Australian landmass that was available for people to live on is now underwater. And that is the exposed continental shelves that fringe Australia's margin, that for most of the human history of Australia, the continental shelves were exposed as dry land. So over the last 17,000 years or so, sea levels have risen 130 metres in the Australian region. And those rising seas inundated over 2 million square kilometres of land around the Australian margin.
And that submerged land was all lost?
Thousands of generations of Aboriginal people lived out their lives on those landscapes that are now inundated by sea level rise. So to tell a meaningful and comprehensive story of Australia's deep past, we need to understand what people were doing on those now submerged landscapes. And of course, those now submerged landscapes are the sea country of contemporary Aboriginal traditional owners who live on the contemporary mainland. Over the last 5 years, I've been part of a team collaborating with the Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation in the Pilbara area of northwestern Western Australia, where we've done a very large-scale integrated study to attempt to model and locate and investigate submerged archaeological sites on the continental shelf. So to do this project was really a proof of concept of how it might be done in one particular area, but how a variety of technologies might be deployed in other areas around Australia.
And what was the process?
We began pretty traditionally by looking at what the terrestrial sites were telling us. So, what are the archaeological sites on the mainland and on the islands of Murujuga, and how might the form and structure of those sites tell us what might have preserved underwater? So, as many people will know, Murujuga is famous for its rock engraving assemblage with over 1 million engraved petroglyphs on the rocks. But there's also stone arrangements and stone house bases. There's rock shelters and shell mounds and shell middens. And all of those different site types that are on the terrestrial landscape today have different survival potential underwater. For example, stone arrangements and stone house bases may well have survived inundation, whereas a thin midden scatterer composed of shellfish may have a much lower survival potential. So we began by looking at those site types and thinking about what might survive best underwater and in the face of inundation. Then we looked at bathymetric charts and other things to understand how the landscape would have changed over time with rising sea levels. And we flew our own LiDAR runs using both terrestrial LiDAR and bathymetric LiDAR. So bathymetric LiDAR actually penetrates the water to a depth of about 10 metres, depending on the clarity of the water. So we were actually able to map the seabed in shallow waters in incredible detail, really a good resolution. We use that to narrow down prospective areas for putting divers in the water. For the areas of water that were in deeper waters, we ran hundreds of kilometres of multi-beam sonar behind a boat to do imaging of those deeper landscapes. So after we'd done that and identified a number of prospective targets, we began doing snorkel and scuba surveys with scientific divers. And a lot of the targets we investigated proved not to have any archaeological potential. In other areas we investigated, we did find Aboriginal stone artefacts on the seabed. And these, as was published recently, are the first confirmed submerged archaeological pre-European heritage found anywhere in Australia. And what we found were hundreds of flake stone artefacts, including pieces of ground edge axes and grindstones on the sea floor to a depth of 14 metres. So these finds really demonstrate that we can find submerged heritage on the continental shelves. And it really begs the question of how many other sites remain to be found around the Australian continental margin, and what can they tell us about the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures in deep time.
So now how do you see the future of archaeological inquiry in Australia?
So the future of archaeology in Australia, to me, is based on two things. Firstly, and most importantly, it's based on collaborating with traditional owners or custodians of land and seascapes, and that's got to really foreground anything else. The second thing is that the future of archaeology in Australia needs to be multidisciplinary. Even more than that, it needs to be transdisciplinary. I think we've even moved beyond the stage where we're simply harnessing a palynologist and a geomorphologist and a geologist to our studies and having the archaeologist pull all those strands together to tell the story of a region or a landscape or the continent. I actually think we're moving towards a period where we're integrating those studies from the outset, not as independent disciplinary studies, but as harmonised studies in an overall program of research where we're actually developing new transdisciplinary methodologies of how we can use all the paleosciences together to address some of the wicked problems that we have in the future.
So what's the potential of that?
To give you just one example of that is how we can use the past to understand the potential impacts of climate-driven sea level rise in the future. Certainly the questions that I most often hear traditional owners and custodians articulating are about land management and are about caring for country and are about working collaboratively on, for example, how old people in the past manage their landscapes and how we might adapt those technologies for future landscape curation and management. Now, to mitigate the impacts on cultural heritage in the coastal zone in the future, we really need an understanding of how sea level changes in the past have impacted coastal landscapes and driven changes in coastal environments.
So what's needed?
To address a question like that, we really need not only archaeology, but we need geomorphology and paleoecology and paleoclimate studies, cultural heritage management approaches and strategies, all drawn together with traditional owner knowledge and aspirations to manage their country, to develop a sophisticated and integrated program of study of how to address a very large scale and looming problem of how we manage those coastal resources into the future. So I think there's enormous potential there for Australian archaeology to be very relevant to contemporary concerns about carbon farming, for example, and also mitigating future climate-driven environmental impacts.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much for talking to me today. The 4 papers that we've been concentrating on are detailed on the website if anybody wants to follow those up. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Foreign Countries. Join me next time for another conversation.